she was taking off, there was a rattling noise, and when it was idling, it was rattling. And whenever we heard it, it only did it when it was cold, it was an 03 Camry, and Charles was saying, this sounds like it's coming from the manifold. So I looked up the technical service bulletin on it, and sure enough, they said 02 to 04 Camrys may rattle because of the intake manifold. There's nothing in there, but they said the air going through there will make rattling sounds, which is weird as all get out, because they never, you know, without any moving parts. But we got a Dorman intake manifold from the parts store and put it on there, and she sent me a message this morning and said, it's wonderful. They replaced all the injector O-rings because whenever they put it back together, there was gas going all over the place. They didn't know. So I had to replace all those O-rings, and now she's smelling a little gas. She wasn't all that concerned about it, but I was. So I said, we need to take another look to make sure that everything's okay and it doesn't have any kind of gas issue. Okay. Engine performance is not about hot rods. Right? It's not about hot rods. Now, not the way we're teaching it here. And somebody used to say, well, I don't really have time to play with hot rods in here because we got to teach people how to fix real cars. You know what I mean?
That's what you said.
And so, underneath, it's a machine that breathes. It has moving parts. It converts power into motion for the purpose of doing work. So, air in, fuel in, you got power, and you got treated exhaust coming out. Okay? That's not really complicated. Everybody pretty much knows that. There's a lot of stuff you just don't think about very much. Combining air and fuel generate force. Our atmosphere is 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, and the rest of it is trace elements. Now, the thing about it is, the CO2 everybody is so worried about is only a tiny percentage of this little teeny tiny wedge. You got me? And you know, out of 100,000 molecules of atmosphere, 35 of them is carbon dioxide, and only one of those 35 molecules of carbon dioxide is man-made. So it's really not worth $1 trillion a year.
When you go into diesel engines, though, isn't the emissions a little different? Don't they have?
The emissions actually on a diesel engine tend to make NOx, which is oxides of nitrogen because of the heat and the combustion. But you're running those through that catalyst and that particle, you know, particulate filter and all that, and your DEF, diesel exhaust fluid and all this hogwash, it gets rid of the particulates. If you drive a diesel, one of these new diesels, through downtown Los Angeles, the air that's coming out the pipe is cleaner than what you're pulling in a breather.
That's what I was preached at down there.
Yeah, it's cleaner. The air coming out is actually cleaner than what's going in.
That's what I was preached.
But notice what happens here with the treated exhaust. If you notice on the side of the road how the grass has got to be mowed all the time, because the cars are feeding it with the exhaust, and it just loves it. It just grows up a storm. They're not teaching you that anymore, but anyway, hydrocarbon fuel. And this, think about this. This is your emission stuff. The ones you two are emissions. So you got this. What you got? You got CO2, right? Mm-hmm. Each molecule of fuel, which is hydrocarbon, wants to get married to 2 molecules of oxygen, and that happens whenever the spark fires. Now that heats up the nitrogen. The nitrogen, which is inert and doesn't burn, expands and pushes the piston down. So the nitrogen is actually the working fluid that's pushing the piston down. See, the fire has burned out by the time the crankshaft has only turned like 23 or 24 degrees on a gas burner. Now on a diesel, it burns all the way down. It's like it's pumping the crank instead of just slapping it, you know. All right, so let's go on. All right, question. On a non-turbocharged engine, why does the air even enter the cylinders? It's not turbocharged, it's naturally aspirated. Why does the air go in there?
Compression.
Huh?
Compression.
There's the oxygen to
Seems
burn.
like compression would push it out. Huh?
There's the oxygen to burn.
Yeah, well, I mean, why does the air even enter the cylinder to begin with before the burn takes
Burn.
place? Huh?
Make power.
What pulls it in? How does that, why is it that when you put a straw in a drink and you take a drink of it, why does that fluid go into your mouth?
Force. Can't say it.
Huh?
Can't say it.
Vacuum?
Search.
Vacuum? Actually, it's pressure. You know why? Where's the pressure coming from?
The cylinder.
Atmosphere. Atmosphere is pushing on the liquid. And what do? You don't even think about this. You just learn to do it whenever you were a baby. But you start with a little cavity in your mouth and you make it bigger. And that makes the pressure in your mouth less than the atmospheric pressure. And the fluid comes through the straw into your mouth. That's how carburetors work. Right? You don't think about that, but that's the way it works. Now, as the valve is open and the piston's going down, it's making the space in the cylinder bigger, and the atmosphere is gonna come pushing in there. What's the atmospheric pressure at sea level?
At sea level.
1 bar?
1 point.
What's perfect, let me ask you this, let's try to tie something together here. What's 14.7 to 1 is, what, you ever heard that number before? That's stoichiometric perfection when it comes to hydrocarbon fuels versus air. That's by weight, right? 14.7 to 1 by weight, okay? Atmospheric pressure is about 14.7 pounds per square inch. Are you getting that? Now, an engine uses about 9,000 gallons of air for each gallon of gas it burns, and it makes a gallon of water for each gallon of gas it burns. That's why whenever in the wintertime you crank it up, you see steam coming out the pipe. The water's being made by the engine. When it's hotter, it just comes out in such, you know, like finer vapor. All right, remember these strokes in order.
Exhaust.
Intake, compression, power, exhaust. Intake, compression, power, exhaust. Can you remember that?
Yes.
You guys gonna remember that?
Yeah.
No.
You're not gonna forget it. I'm not gonna walk up to you in the shop in a little few days and say, give me the 4 strokes in order. You're not gonna be able to, you're not gonna say, duh, I don't know. What about you? You gonna remember it? You gonna remember it? Intake, compression, power, exhaust.
It's like what, suck?
Intake,
squeeze?
compression, power, exhaust. Suck, squeeze, bang, blow.
Yep.
Intake, compression, power,
Intake.
exhaust. You got it?
Power.
Everybody ready? Intake, compression, power, exhaust. Intake, compression, power, exhaust. All right. Now,
Yeah, I'm exhausted of this stuff.
all right. Now, 14.5 more or less at sea level. That's 1 bar. When you ever hear about somebody talking about bar and millibars and all this kind of stuff, you know, that is the unit of pressure at sea level per square inch. Now, why is that important for airplanes? Because without that pressure, they can't fly. Right? Okay, so coming in through your air filter, you got a filter in. Is true or false? An air filter has got to have restriction to work. If it doesn't, it ain't gonna stop the dirt. Okay? There's a little downward restriction there. All right, goes on in here. There's a throttle plate there into your plenum. What's the plenum for? You want to make sure.
Everything's equal.
Huh? Yeah, exactly. That's a good point. Good answer. Everything has got to be equal. You're actually putting pressure into that plenum so that every cylinder will get the equal amount of everything. When you've got EGR emission, people, when you got EGR on there, you're always going to have the EGR either feeding each one of these separately, or right there behind the throttle plate will be your EGR. And your EGR is basically going to be fed to every cylinder equal to when you're driving down the road. Never at idle, never at wide open throttle, never with a cold engine. Only cruising down the road. All right. See this right here? This is a scope pattern collected with a transducer. See, intake, compression, power, exhaust. You notice how that goes up a little bit when the piston's coming up and the exhaust valve's open? But that's actually supposed to be equal to atmospheric pressure right there, or slightly higher. Intake, notice how the pressure went down again, compression and squeeze it, power, exhaust. So the piston strokes, you can kind of figure them out. I've got a dedicated PowerPoint presentation we're going to go over that with. You can measure that waveform on an unhealthy engine on the cylinder in question and find out what's going on if you know how to interpret that waveform. And it's pretty handy. All right, now, this is the basic sensor package the PCM keeps track of. Mass airflow, MAP. A lot of them nowadays have MAP and mass airflow. For a long time they had MAP, but they didn't have mass airflow. Chrysler stayed the heck away from mass airflow for the most part on their domestic packages. But you know, Ford got mass airflow in 1989 on their Mustang, and they did everything else wound up with mass airflow a year or so later. All right, there's your throttle position sensor. It needs to know, are they moving the throttle and how much, how fast, and all this kind of thing. Cam sensor and crank sensor. If it's got multi-point, if it's got sequential fuel injection that follows the firing order, the cam sensor basically tells it which injector to fire first. It also tells it, because usually it's making its cut at 24 after top dead center, the fire has already gone out in each cylinder at 24 degrees after top dead center, and it's okay to start the next. Can you imagine if the thing starts spraying fuel before the fire goes out? What's going to happen then?
Keep going fire.
What do you call that? Induction backfire? Boom! You know, it pops out the intake, this kind of thing. You ever heard one backfire going down the road and it scare the daylights out of you? Sound like a bomb going off, you know?
You ever shoot my brake cleaner inside of the intake and try to crank it?
Yeah,
Well, it
but
depends on the brake cleaner. You can use that CRC brake clean that's not flammable. It smells like it would blow up, but it won't even burn.
y'all will kill us all.
But just about all the rest of the brake clean is real flammable. But anyway,
I was there when.
all right, y'all pays attention here. What's this? Since the PCM is monitoring the air via the mass airflow, any kind of air leak will cause issues. Now, if it doesn't have a mass airflow, it just has the map, an air leak is not as much of a problem, it's still a problem, but not as much. So the mass airflow has got to know how much, if you notice how your PCV system now is pulling air out of the air inlet tube into the engine, and it's, you know, it actually is having to meter the PCV. You can put a PCV valve in one of these new engines that's got a little bit too big of a, if you just grab a PCV valve off the part shelf and pop it in there, you may see your fuel trim levels go crazy. If you've got an oil filler cap that's got a gasket on it that's leaking air, it's pulling air in, it's not metered through that mass airflow, you're gonna have fuel trim issues. So be aware of that, understand your fuel trim stuff. All right, back in the day, we had carburetors. And what you had is you had your fuel sitting in there with atmosphere pushing on it. And there was this venturi here, and whenever the air would go through there, there's your choke plate, it would actually cause low pressure that would pull this up and then it would mist in there. All right, for the fuel to burn efficiently, it's got to be atomized. The carburetor did that for a long time. And so this it's just a little simple cutaway of how a carburetor would work. All right, fuel injection atomizes the fuel better than a carburetor and gives less trouble over time. All right, this kind of system appeared on some vehicles in the late 70s in various configurations. These were the ones that I was working on when I was at the Ford dealer a long time ago. And
Didn't work on mine.
Huh? What?
Didn't work on mine.
On yours? Yeah, you got one of those. One
TBI.
of those TBI ones, yeah. How much fuel pressure is a TBI supposed to have? Yours?
What, like 50 pounds?
12.
Oh, man, way off. I didn't look it up or anything, I was guessing.
12 or 13 pounds. If those gun injectors, you got, these injectors right here, they're supposed to have like 40 pounds. And that's the fuel pressure regulator right there. So the fuel comes in, raises that diaphragm, it regulates the pressure so that it's always pretty much about the same. This is above the throttle plate, right? All right. All right.
That's what I got right there.
That's yours right here. That's a TB. Chrysler had TBI, but it had higher fuel pressure than the GM stuff. If a GM truck like yours has got a stopped up fuel filter, it'll feel like you got a catalytic converter that's clogged or something. But it's hard to check the fuel pressure on those if you don't have the adapters to do it. It's aggravating. They don't have a place where you can check the fuel pressure real easy, which is dumb. All right, so anyway, that's it. You can just rebuild those throttle bodies, throw in kit and stuff, that kind of thing. Port fuel injection, you got one per cylinder. You've seen this. You guys saw this yesterday, right? And these O-rings are really important. If these O-rings are cut, what happens? Fuel leaks out everywhere. There's also O-rings here. If these O-rings are hard or cracked or leaking, you're going to have a vacuum leak right there, and it's going to cause it to run lousy. It may cause it to skip on one cylinder. Keep that in mind. But see this right here, injector wire harness, basically, well, your injector wire harness is going to feed that. But look here, you got a fuel supply, fuel pump, high pressure, that's usually inside the tank nowadays. Fuel filter goes into the fuel rail, and the regulator, it returns back. That is a return fuel system. And then it's got all of these, you know, inputs. All right, here's your basic principle. The crank sensor is basically tells the firing frequency of it. So as your engine is speeding up, your injectors are going click, 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 click. They speed up faster when the engine is running, when its crank is turning quicker, right? In other words, it starts going click, 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 click. When it's idling, they go click, 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 click. So that's basically where you're going to be getting that. Now, one time there was a guy that sent me an email, and he said he had been working down here. He had to drill out some bolts, and you know he had to drill out a bolt down there, and he had to use a torch and all this kind of stuff on some kind of a car he was working on. And he says, and it sputters and pops and it won't start and all that. And I said, you need to get your oscilloscope. And he said he had one, and hook it up to your cam and your crank sensors and see what a pattern looks like. He never would do that. He kept telling me he never would do it. And finally he found out one of these teeth broke off around here. One of these broke off, and that kept it from starting. If he'd have put a scope on it, would he have found it right away? Yes, he would. Okay. So anyway. The frequency of the injector's fire is determined by the crank sensor. The timing of the firing is determined by the cam sensor. And the pulse width, which is how long the injector is open, is determined by the modifications that are given there by the temperature. As a matter of fact, when you give it the gas, the throttle position sensor, it adds a few extra squirts. What does the carburetor do when you give it the gas? It's got a couple of accelerator pump jets. Spray in there. The engine still needs that extra fuel when you're cracking the throttle, so it gives you extra injector pump squirts. Also, when you're starting it up, it needs extra fuel too, which is on what happens on that. You hit the gas, it sprays the gas, the choke shuts. On this, it does it with the injectors on the fuel injection system. For years, sometimes they put a cold start injector on them and that kind of thing, and then they figured out, well, we can do that with regular injectors. Now, this is how it's basically wired. I simplified this somewhat. You're gonna have this relay, and it's gonna be firing up each injector, and they're gonna be sending, it's gonna be sending a signal here. This is what it looks like. Watch this, pay attention. See that? That's you're actually measuring this right here. This 12 volts that's coming through here is right here, and when this pulls that to ground, this is how long, you got voltage over time here. This is how long it stays open. What's this spike for? Where did that come from? Why is it so much more than 12 volts? Anybody know? Do we have some ADD at work in here? What happens when you collapse a magnetic field across a coil? You get a spike. It creates a spike. That's how an ignition coil works, right? This spike is only about 50 volts, right? On an air conditioner compressor clutch, when you release that one, it pops about 400 volts out there, so they got a clamping diode in there to keep that from going back in there and punching the engine controller in the face. Okay, so you might notice that idle air bypass valve, it is built with a diode in there, a clamping diode built into the valve. Anyway, this goes on until next time. So this is what you're going to accept. If you see a pattern that looks like that, you better know it's an injector pulse, because I'm liable to hit you with that. You guys are going to have to scope some stuff and get these anyway. And I've got a sheet that you're going to have to do. All right, Sun Tzu, The Art of War, is often quoted by saying, know your enemy. Got it? Now listen, the customer's not your enemy.
The vehicle.
The vehicle's not your enemy. The customer's concern is your enemy. You're going after the problem. The noise on the Toyota was your enemy. And you defeated it, but you created another enemy, which was the gas smell. We gotta make sure that's okay. To defeat that enemy, you gotta gather intel and sort it out. So, you gotta gather information instead of some of these shops that I heard, when somebody says, my air conditioner doesn't work, they shine a flashlight around and could check a couple of fuses and say, we don't know what's wrong, but we think it'll probably be $1,000. Without even trying to find out what's wrong, And that sounds like a bad comic strip. All right, some rules haven't changed. Carburetor or fuel injection, it don't matter. It needs the proper amount of extra fuel on first cold start, but not too much. A cold engine needs more fuel in the mix than a warm engine, and when the throttle is open, extra fuel is needed even on a hot engine. You got it? Now, too much fuel? Why will a flooded spark plug not fire?
It's wet, it won't.
You gotta do better than that. It won't.
It's wet, it won't.
It's wet. It
Spark
won't.
won't jump the gap.
Huh? Exactly. Where does the spark run in?
It's just running through the gasoline.
Exactly. That's exactly the answer I was looking for. Noah, give it to Noah.
That was so
Noah's the
smart.
man. Either right, Noah, go. It runs on the gas. It doesn't jump across the gap because the easiest path it can take is to ground through the wetness. Right? The PCM depends heavily on sensor inputs to make fuel calculations. When you see black smoke, what is that? Hydrocarbons.
No, that's when you floor it on diesel.
Oh, please, you're making it up in school. All right, high fuel pressure, saturated canister, stuck open injector, ruptured fuel pressure regulator diaphragm. You know the little vacuum hose that goes to your fuel pressure regulator? If you pull that off and there's gas coming out of that fuel pressure regulator, that diaphragm's busted. Well, where's the gas go? I've actually seen a leak like that go into the manifold, go on top of the piston, hydraulic lock the piston and destroy the engine because of a fuel pressure regulator diaphragm that was busted.
Will vapor lock an engine?
Actually, hydraulic lock. Too much gas goes in there, into one of the cylinders, because it runs down through there, and it basically you switch it off. One of the valves is open, and that as the pressure is leaking down, it puts enough gas in there. You can't compress that liquid, and I've seen it just boom, bend a rod and just destroy the engine because of a simple little fuel pressure regulator diaphragm ruptured. So if you got one that's running rich, the first thing you ought to do, if it's got a little vacuum hose going to that fuel pressure regulator, I'm going to pull that off, see if I see fuel there. If I see fuel there, I'm done until I put a regulator on it. You got it? All right, let's go. Fuel burns more efficiently the better it's atomized. That's why you've got little teeny tiny droplets coming in here through these gasoline direct injection. It's squirting it right in there. It's not behind the valve like the other ones. And the distribution, and gasoline direct injection can either, it not only has got a control over how much fuel it puts in there, it can squirt it a certain way. It's got the timing of it. It can be altered on gasoline direct injection, and it's got really, really high pressure, you know, on those, fuel pressure on those too. Now, gathering data without OBD2, that's happened a long time ago, but it illustrates why we need to know the vehicle we're working on. Donnie says, this man's kicking me around. He's working on this high mileage 90 model Ford van that had eaten his lunch for his supper for several days. I was over visiting, I was already teaching at the time. And I says, I reached over here and I felt of that little connector. Well, here's a general rule of thumb. If a 90 model Ford vehicle has an E4OD transmission or mass airflow, it'll have data stream. Mustang doesn't count on that. Because when they had to retype the program for that, they went in and added the data stream with it, except on the Mustang. Scan tool data stream lets us see things like fuel trim that we can't see with hard measurements. You cannot measure fuel trim with a meter. You cannot measure fuel trim with a scope. But you can bore Kayla to the point where she's about to go to sleep. All right, a scope is really necessary, but a scan tool is the first easy step, if the PCM will talk. All right? Now this is what the connector looked like on OBD1 Fords. The data link connector is right here, and when I looked at his data link connector, those wires were there. And I said, you've got data link on this. He said, well, it said I didn't have data link on it. And he says, I said, well, tell it you got an E4OD transmission. And he says, but it's got an AOD, it doesn't have an E4OD. He said, lie to it. Tell it you got one. Because the scan tool would only give you the data stream choice if it thought you had an E4OD. This was an anomaly. So he punched it in, told it had E4OD, and when he did that, he wound up getting data stream. He was really spooked by that because he'd been fighting it a week thinking he didn't have data stream. Of course, he could have measured all the voltages live, you know, whenever by looking. Now, what we saw was the throttle position sensor, it was floating. And if it comes off a closed throttle, it thinks you're patting the gas, and what's it going to do? It's going to put more gas in there. So when we crank it up cold, it would make all kinds of black smoke until it warmed up a little bit. And all it needed was a TP sensor because you're not even moving the throttle, the voltage is floating around. That was the deal. This is engine performance class. All right, if we hadn't known that a TP signal floating could cause rich flooding, we might have overlooked it. Right? It didn't throw a code. All right, that's why it's important to understand why it does it. Now, Jerry's a friend of mine that drives older cars. We just replaced the mass airflow on his F89 Maxima for a no idle problem. Incidentally, by the way, if you've got one of these Nissan engines that's a V, cam sensors are weird. Sometimes if you got a bad cam sensor, it won't make any difference at all. Sometimes if you got a bad cam sensor, it may start and it may not. If you got a bad cam sensor in only one bank, it may start hard. So, you know, think about cam sensors. If you get a PO340 code and you're trying to find a problem, you might want to go after that first. He was so pleased with the repair he brought us his Camry. This had never happened when he was driving it. She said it was likely to quit or fail to start several times a day. And we were using the old OCT Genesis, and it was supposed to talk to it, but it wouldn't do it. So it's an old rice burner it wouldn't talk to. And so we could dig for the non-com problem. How long would that take? Let's forget about that and try to win the fight another way, because she don't care if it's talking or not. So I worked on Ford a long time by back probing sensors and reading the voltages of them. If you know good data, then you'll recognize bad data. You got it? So every time you get a chance to plug a scan tool into a good car, plug it in, see what it's supposed to look like, and when you see a bad one, you'll know. All right, so we fired it up and waited for it to quit. 30 minutes later, I noticed it was sitting there. And do we have spark? Yep. Did it have fuel? Yep. Well, hadn't checked the pressure, but we went ahead and checked the pressure, and it was okay. And we wanted to see what we let the timing light flash while we were spinning it over to see if it was firing when it was supposed to instead of some other time. So I pulled the air cleaner off, shot a little carb spray in there to see if it would bust off on that. You ever do that? Shoot a little carb spray in there, see if it'll fire up? What's that telling you? That tells you that you got ignition and it's in time. If it'll fire up on the carb spray, you got fuel issues, right? All right, if fuel starvation had been the case, it would have started, but it didn't. Now, for people that hadn't locked horns with one of these, there comes a point where things get personal. Now, Now, of course, if you're like McBride, you'll just wanna set fire to it and walk away, right? But he usually hangs out until he gets it done. Isn't that right? All right, stay awake, Caleb. All right. Fuel pressure testing, we went in and did it, but it was fine. We didn't see it dropping, we didn't see any problem with it, it had good fuel pressure. If the fuel pressure was at 41 pounds when it died, it was time to see if we had water in the fuel, so didn't really find anything there. All right, but we did find when we did a scope that it had a very wide injector pulse. See that really wide injector pulse? That was kind of crazy. And it only did this during the no starts after it quit. Wide pulse, normal pulse. See the difference? We were seeing something. This was a smoking gun. Why would it do that? So I targeted a time when it was starting just fine. Then I disconnected a fuel pump and created a no start to see what that would do. With no fuel pressure, it was a little wider, but not that much. So this wasn't a fuel pressure loss thing, right? So never went over about 10 milliseconds instead of getting really wide like that. But what we did notice, check back probing the engine coolant temperature sensor, this is not supposed to be way up there, particularly with the engine warm. That's like the engine coolant sensor is unplugged. And what's that doing? That's giving us 40 below zero. That means it thinks it needs a lot of fuel. That means it's putting too much in there, right? That's what the ECT looks like. Ragged. It would do this and then it'd be ragged. When it was down here ragged and like that, it would do better. But whenever it popped up here at that top, you had a no start situation, you had a stalling engine. Here you go. Let's do this right quick. There's no direct electrical connection between primary and secondary windings, true or false? That's on these coil packs.
What?
These are primary and secondary winding, that's primary, that's secondary. Alright, technician B says if one spark plug wire is disconnected from a distributor's ignition coil, the companion on it won't fire. He's wrong. He's right. Which of the following reasons for a solar misfire is least likely to raise hydrocarbon emissions? You're going to get more hydrocarbons out the pipe that way, that way, that way, or that way. Low fuel pressure. Low fuel pressure is not going to give you extra hydrocarbons because you ain't got as much fuel. You're running lean, not rich. On a 4-liter straight 6 engine, when cylinder number 1's on compression stroke, its cylinder number 6 is where?
Should be on compression
Huh?
or power.
Huh? Are you just making that up?
Should be on intake.
No, it's going to be on exhaust. Because think about it, cylinder number 1 and 6 are companions. They're like this. And so one of them's going to be on compression, the other's going to be on exhaust. All right. Technician A says some engines will run with a sensor unplugged. They're talking about the cam sensor unplugged. Technician B says the crank sensor always produces an analog rather than digital signal. This guy's wrong, this guy's right. And there's your crank and there's your cam. PCM is believed to have a bad injector driver because the injector is inoperative. A says a known good PCM from similar vehicle should be connected. Here's the thing, if you suspect PCM, what you need to do is move that PCM to a good vehicle if you got one, to see if the good vehicle acts like the bad vehicle did. What happens if you take the good PCM off of the good vehicle and put it on the bad vehicle and it fries that PCM?
Somebody's got to buy it.
So always take the bad PCM and put it on a good vehicle to see if the good vehicle acts bad. You know, don't take the good PCM and put it on that. All right. All right, so technician A says there's no reason to check the ignition timing on an engine with no timing adjustment. Actually, there is, because some things can affect that. If this little, like on some of that Escort, if you left that balancer bolt loose and it wallows that little keyway out, it'll change the timing because this will be changing as you're driving. We may take off one time and it run bad, and next time it may run good and all that because it's silly moving around now. Most of them are press fit. That one goes on there real easy. You know what I'm talking about on that Escort? All right, technician B says ignition timing should be checked anyway to eliminate it as a possible cause. All right, 13 inches. If you have low vacuum on a truck like this with the distributor, a stretch timing chain can cause that. You can find out how much timing chain stretch you got by turning the engine the way it turns, and you stop it whenever you're on 0, and then you turn the engine backwards until the distributor starts to move. You got the cap off. If you turn it backwards 10 or 15 degrees before the distributor starts to move, you know you got that much time in change stretch, right? So that's what this question's about. Advanced ignition timing can cause what? Hard starting, ping, piston damage, any or all of the above.